Dean? Right. And so how did I get to know Ubuntu? Actually, that was because as a student, I did an exchange program in South Africa at the University of Cape Town. I landed in a university compound where all the white students were basically in private housing and all the black students were on campus. And since I was an exchange student, I landed in a completely black community. So I had a full cultural immersal for the full year that I was in Cape Town. That was also a very special year because it was in 1994. So then you can guess more or less how old I am. When the transition took place from the apartheid South Africa to the new South Africa. So I know that recently in South Africa, the Ubuntu concept has been used a lot also by commercial enterprises. But at the time that I was there, I really learned it in the townships, at the campus, and from my black fellow students. So why do I really like this picture of Ubuntu? I am because we are is the concept. Is because one day I went to the township and somebody said something to me and I said, but why are you doing this that way? I don't remember exactly what it was about. And then he said to me, that is because that is Ubuntu. And I said, what is that? What is that? Ubu what? And then everybody around me were standing outside the store. And most of the people I didn't know. I was there with a friend of mine. Everybody around formed a circle like you see at this picture. And one by one, all of them started telling me what Ubuntu meant to them. And for me, it was a very, very special moment because I didn't fully grasp at that moment what they are saying, but I did understand it was something very important and yeah, very spiritual to people. So it was a moment that really touched me and I took with me, yeah, for the rest of my life. So after I studied in Cape Town, I went back to the Netherlands and I joined the Foreign Ministry, the Africa department. And basically, I still visited up and down, but gradually my career developed in other areas and I forgot about Ubuntu. I went to Asia, I went to Turkey, and I went to different parts of the world. And then I landed at the Development Commission and we were studying the Millennium Development Goals. And after we had finished the review, I said, but I think we're missing an essential dimension because we're not talking about Ubuntu. And then my professor said, Ubu, what? What are you talking about? So then I thought, if these people have all been in development cooperation for the last 20 or 30 years, and they don't really know what Ubuntu is, then I think I have a little mission to fulfill. So I started my PhD research on the relationship between what was then the post-2015 agenda and Ubuntu. I didn't make it before the SDGs were concluded, so the research developed into basically a criticism of the SDGs from an Ubuntu perspective. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of Ubuntu, which is properly associated with the proverb I am because we are, and we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so it means I am because we are. A person is a person through other persons. And here you can see the Zulu or Xhosa expression, umuntu ngumuntu nagabantu. I'm probably not pronouncing it properly, but umuntu means a human being and Bantu means the people. So basically a human being is only there, or your humanity is only derived from other people. So it is an inverse concept from the individualist Western concept. And it says basically that first we are a collective, and as an individual, you are part of a collective. So it's not the same as adding up individuals and saying the add up of the individuals is the collective. No, when you are born through your parents, of course, but also you are standing on the shoulders of your ancestors or the people who came before you. And you're part of a community that you're born in, you're part of a culture that you're born in, and basically as an individual, you can't separate yourself from that collective. And I think that is a very important and profound insight. Can we move to the next slide? Now, I said to my African professor, because I contacted an African professor in South Africa when I started my study, and I said, but this whole saying that Ubuntu Nagabantu, it doesn't say Ubuntu, so where's the relationship between the two? So then he said, but the word Ubuntu is a more profound word than I am because we are, because basically Ubuntu talks about the concept of the cosmos or the universe from the African perspective. And since African philosophy is not a written philosophy like European philosophy, where Nietzsche as a philosopher sits in his study rooms and tells us what the wisdom of the world should be, but it is a living philosophy where it's embodied in the language and in the proverbs of people. You need to analyze also the language to understand the significance. So the word Ubu, as the philosopher said, means enfolded being before it manifests, in motion towards Natu, temporarily having become. I found that a very complicated expression. So I summarized that in Ubuntu is basically abstract being or potential being, and the two is a life force being. So that is my interpretation of enfolded being before it manifests, so the abstract being, and then the two temporarily having become. So it also means that the life force comes and goes, so there's a circle of life. So Ubu and the two meet, and then life manifests itself. So I made a drawing because I like to visualize things. I'm also a visual artist. So the black circle is Ubu, abstract or potential being. And the little yellow circles is the life force that brings all that potential being into force. So basically, Dorine exists potentially before she's being born, and then the life force comes and brings her to life. So you can see in African Nguni languages, if you just mainly African language of Southern Africa, that a lot of words end on the word Ntu. So for example, the word for nature is Kintu or Bintu in plural. So it is Ki plus Ntu. So Ki is potential nature, and Ntu says nature is coming into being. So then it becomes Kintu. So the same counts for the word for human, which is Muntu, or in plural Bantu, which is the purple circle below. So Mu is potential human, and Muntu is the human that has basically come to life. Now, what is very important to understand is that the community of life from the African perspective is not only the people who live now. It's not only us here present, but it is also the people who came before us. And sometimes we call that ancestors, but African philosophers prefer to call them living dead. So living dead means people may have passed over to the other side, but since they are still being remembered, they're still also alive and connected to us. And the same counts basically for those people who are not yet born, but who are coming in future, which in Western languages we call future generations, but Africa, they say they're yet to be born. Those people are also part of the community, because you have to take into account their interests and their need for resources in the future. So the community of people that we're talking about, through which we are, because I am because we are, basically I am also through my ancestors, and I am also through the people that are still to come. And that is very interesting because it also links Ubuntu to the earth and to care for nature, because the ancestors don't go to heaven, they basically go to earth, and they're connected to the land and to earth. And the future generations are also connected to the earth in the terms of resources that we need. So when you do a violation of Ubuntu, when you're not being respectful of others, that can also apply to the earth. So there's no difference in wording to say that there was a violation of the earth or a violation of humanity. So both of them are a violation of Ubuntu. I think that's a very important thing to realize. Next slide. So other than in the grammar of the language, you can also find a lot of significance of what Ubuntu means in African proverbs. So I'm going to read a few to you. The first one is about democracy. So the source and justification of all power is in the people. I think Western people can still relate to that. But then they also say, we may go our own way. Whenever urgent and vital issues arrive, we still have the obligation to come together and try and find a common solution. So this means that democracy is not only a representational democracy where we go and vote once every 4 years. I actually voted this morning because we have elections in the Netherlands. And then that person represents you for those coming years. No, it is a way of democracy where we seek consensus. So when I studied in South Africa, I also joined African choir. So we were some 80, 90 people. And whenever we would have choir practice, after the choir practice, we would have a meeting. So in the meeting, the director would propose something, and then the proposal was being discussed. And the discussion would go on until such time that everybody had agreed with the solution. So if there were still 10 people who said that we want to go the other way, the conductor would say, okay, so here are the arguments for and here are the arguments against. And at the end of the meeting would say, can you consent in the fact that maybe you disagree, but we are all going to go this direction. So the meeting would last until everybody would say yes. So you may think that this is quite inefficient from a Western perspective, but at the same time, they also say, if you want to go fast, you go alone. And if you want to go far, you can go together. So consensus politics is a very important democratic concept. The other concept that arises is also the fact that community is what makes you. It's what makes us together, but also what makes you as an individual. So when it comes to issues of crimes or violations of Ubuntu or violations of humanity, there's a need for truth and reconciliation. So that means that everybody has to contribute to the common solution. It also means that the objective of justice is not only to get back to someone or retribution or punishment, but the objective of justice is about reconciliation and coming back to the community. I'm coming back to that. So the next proverb says, if faced with a choice between wealth and the preservation of life of another human being, one should choose the life of the other. Basically, that means that sharing goes above accumulation of wealth. And some philosophers have said that in the African mind, the entire life is one big exercise of mutual aid. So it's about exchange on an equal footing. That means also that there's sometimes criticism at Africa that there is not sufficient upward mobility, but then upward mobility is basically not the objective, because the objective is to share the wealth with others so that you elevate the community. Now we have 3 more proverbs. One says, no single human being can be thoroughly and completely useless. And then I come back to the concept of justice. So it basically means that everybody is part of the community. Everybody has a value, and it doesn't matter if that person cannot produce within the economy, whether that person is ill or whether that person has a handicap or whether that person has a criminal record. At the end of the day, everybody is part of that community and part of common humanity. And therefore, it also means that if someone makes a mistake, the community is partly responsible in the fact that that person may have to be punished, but that person also needs to be made part of that common humanity and of that common community again. So the concept of reconciliation and restorative justice is extremely important. And that's also why we know the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which became very famous, of South Africa. And that is actually based on the concept of Ubuntu. And the concept of Ubuntu was therefore also part of the draft constitution of South Africa in the, I think, 1994, to enable the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So basically, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was first thought up basically for the crimes that happened within the ANC and within the Black community, but because there was a demand from the apartheid government that all the security forces should get amnesty, then they said, okay, we can talk about that only if there's going to be a Truth and Reconciliation process. So that's how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came into being. The last two proverbs, I really like them. If God dishes you rice in a basket, do not wish to eat soup. So you also have to accept your fate. And no one shows a child the supreme being. So spirituality is self-evident. So the whole concept of Ubuntu is an earthly concept, but it is a human concept, but it is also a metaphysical and deeply spiritual concept. So you can also say that Ubuntu is the, as it were, original religion of African peoples before major world religions arrived. I'm going to the next slide. Yes, the environment or nature. I still wanted to refer to a concept in Sotho language, which is a different language from Zulu and Xhosa. It's not a Nguni language. And they have a concept which is called seriti. And seriti is basically a field that connects all living beings. So as I tried to explain before, nature or everything around us is basically also part of the community or part of the Ubuntu concept, and therefore deserves the same respect as human beings deserve, or as the ancestors deserve, or the generations to come. You can also reason that from a rational point of view and say to care for another implies caring for the physical nature as well. And without such care, the interdependence between human beings and the physical nature would be undermined. But I believe it's much deeper than that, because it's also intuitive feeling of being connected to the land, connected to nature, and connected to basically everything that is spirited. So it's not only animals or plants that are alive, but everything that is surrounding you is alive. Next slide. So to say a little bit more about the nature concept of Ubuntu. There is a very particular section in the Bill of Rights of the South African Constitution, which actually recognizes the future generations. And South Africa was the first nation to put future generations in its constitution. So it was very progressive at the time in 1996. At the same time, you can ask, why are the ancestors not part of the constitution? So was the constitution really based on the concept of Ubuntu? Or was only lip service being paid to the concept of Ubuntu by the drafters of the Constitution? But I'm going to read the section of the Bill of Rights to you, and it says the following. The right to an environment that is not harmful to the health and well-being, and to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations. Now, here below, you see a picture of a demonstration of the Xolobeni mining project at the South African coast. And there are some traditional leadership involved in that protest against the mine. And one of the traditional leaders, princess of the Amadiba tribe, says the following, the quote on the right. So that mandate does not simply arise from the bills of rights only. The mandate of protecting the earth. It is a duty that is implicit in our sense of accountability to our ancestors who are identified within the earth. The strong attachment to the land which traditional communities have is a source of indigenous knowledge, and properly understood, it's a progressive, inclusive cosmology. So here you see the Ubuntu concept as I explained to you. As the planet is increasingly compromised by a development logic that places life at the service of the economy, traditional leaders and customary law work from the inverse assumption: the economy must be at the service of life. The next slide. So I'm going to give you a few practical consequences of the Ubuntu philosophy and how it has been implemented, because I work at the Foreign Ministry, and the Foreign Ministry consists of very practical people. So if I come with African philosophy, some people say to me, that's very nice, idealistic, wish thinking, what should we do with that? idealist. And I say it's not only idealistic wish thinking, because it's also been, materialized in law and in some economic and governance initiatives. And also in South African diplomacy, they call their diplomacy Ubuntu diplomacy. But there's also many flaws, of course. And then I also respond to them that human rights are also idealistic wish thinking, because we have not really realized human rights, and we do have a whole department for human rights in our ministry. And that argument seems to convince some people. So I said Ubuntu is human rights basically for Africa. So what did they do? If you would reason from the Ubuntu perspective, and I can't go very deeply into that, you would basically look at a complete restructuring of how we go about economy and what is the meaning of economy. So someone said to me, Ubuntu could mean a fundamental restructure of the economy into solidarity, community, and localized economy. First of all, they did recognize Ubuntu in what they call the Bato Pele policy. And that also touches on the subject that Emandine and his colleagues are studying. Because Bato Pele, Bato is another word, a Sotho word for Ubuntu. So it has the same meaning, but it's just in a different language. And Pele means first. So Bato Pele means Ubuntu first, or the people first. And that is a public governance a system in which they said we come from an apartheid legacy, and we never want the government to treat people again the way they were treated in the apartheid time. So government needs to respect the people. So therefore they drew up a set of 8 or 9 principles, which you can read in my article, about how government should be accountable to the citizen, and how there should also be redress mechanisms if people feel not respected by the government. So this is basically more about government service delivery and how they should go about it. I must also say, and I discussed that in the article that Emandine mentioned in the title of my lecture, there's a lot of flaws in the implementation of it. So it's not like it went ideally, because well, there were many problems in the transition. Then there's a few other initiatives that I can mention, which do recognize the concept of Ubuntu or the concept of extended family. But as a whole, you cannot say that the South African economy is based on the principle of Ubuntu, which is of course also part of the negotiations that had to take place between the apartheid government and the transitional government. So one of the examples is, for example, that child grants in South Africa don't go to, only to direct family members, but they can go to the primary caregiver. So that means that if the child is staying with an aunt or an uncle, or even if it's not a related person, that person can still receive the child welfare grants. So that basically recognize the importance of extended family and the importance of community, and the fact that the child is raised by the community, as they say, and not only by the nuclear family. Another concept is, for example, home-based care. So the fact that it's important, as I mentioned the proverb, that everybody's part of the community. So also the people who are ill or the elderly people. And so there's a preference for people to be taken care of within their community and within their home. Other examples that were mentioned to me by interviewees were the local food systems and homegrown food, some of the cooperatives that still function within the townships, for example, joint childcare. And in general, the whole idea that equality is a very important concept within Ubuntu, and the whole idea that Ubuntu in itself implies an inclusive society. But as I said, the South African economy is mainly based on capitalist Western-style economy, as the entire world economy is. I'm going to go to a few legal concepts. I need to rush because I want to have some time for discussion. I don't know if we can go on a little bit longer. So in the practical sense, I already told you Ubuntu was part of the draft constitution, but it was taken out in the final constitution. I'm afraid that this slide is in Dutch. I don't know how that happened, so I'm going to translate it to you. What happened is that the Constitutional Court, which also included some of the drafters of the Constitution, like Albie Sachs, started recognizing Ubuntu as the spirit of the Constitution, and therefore they made some jurisprudence. So there were some law cases in which they used Ubuntu to justify their decision. So it's very controversial in South Africa because some people say, but they were not allowed to do that. You can't rely on the spirit of Constitution if it's not written in the Constitution. I would say it's part of the legal history because it was in the draft Constitution. So in that sense, as a lawyer, I would say it's justified. That led, for example, to the abolition of the capital punishment. That could have also been justified without Ubuntu, but Ubuntu was one of the arguments for the abolition of capital punishment, because as we are all part of the community, the objective of the law and of justice is not retribution, it's not to get even. It also led to more protection of tenants. So there is not an all sacred private property concept. It basically says that if the tenants don't have any other living or dwelling to go to, they cannot just be evicted from their housing. So there is more protection for tenants, even if it's illegal tenants. So the sacrosanct concept of private property was sort of somewhat diminished. There was also a law case about migrants, in which they said migrants who have paid taxes are also entitled to grants, to government grants, and that is based on the principle of hospitality, and hospitality is also part of the spirit of Ubuntu. Batu Pele policy I already went into. And the last thing, of course, you can see is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Bishop Tutu is presiding over that. So the participation of victims in criminal law cases is extremely important, because truth and justice will only be achieved if there is a meeting between the victims and the perpetrator, or the family of the victims and the perpetrator. So it's all about finding that common humanity. So now I go to my last two slides. I hope you can read this, but basically what I did, and this is like a summary of my thesis in a very short version, because my thesis is about 1,000 words, but I try to make it a little bit more tangible for people about the three philosophies I studied, which was Buddhist happiness, African Ubuntu, and Latin American buen vivir. So we're only going to look at the African Ubuntu column, which is in the middle. So basically, the Sustainable Development Goals claim to be universalist because they were accepted by all UN member states. And there were also huge consultations done with civil society and business and ordinary people, about 5 million people they consulted. But at the end of the day, they were negotiated by governments. So one of my questions was, but how universal is this? And do these people who sit in the governments really have the freedom to express principles like Ubuntu philosophy? So I asked people about how do you look at the SDGs? And some of the Africans were very pragmatic. They said, you know, whenever these schemes come up, it's not really our thing, but we please the global north while doing our own thing locally. That was basically what someone said to me, which I found quite humoristic. It's like, you know, we know that Western donors want all these frameworks, but this whole idea of frameworks is not really an African idea, because we are relationship based. But if the donors want it, we sign up with it, we go along, and then we'll see how the relationship develops later on. That's also why this SDG 17 or what used to be MDG 8, the global partnership, is so important to countries of the global south and African countries. Now, at the same time, I asked people, so there's a slogan attached to the SDGs, which is leave no one behind. Now, what would be the slogan if you would rethink the SDGs from an African perspective? And I think that the most essential concept of Ubuntu, or from the African perspective, is the saying of life is mutual aid. So leave no one behind. If you think about it a little bit more deeply, you can ask the question, who is behind and who is ahead? So what SDGs are we looking at? Because the environmental SDGs, I must say, my country in the Netherlands, we are in the global north, generally considered very highly developed, but we're doing very poorly on the green SDGs. So you can see leave no one behind. It still comes from the MDGs, which was a poverty reduction framework. And it also implies some kind of a pyramid, a hierarchy, that some people are ahead and some people are behind, but we don't really know what is the ultimate objective. So who is behind and who is ahead it's all very implicit. So then I go to the next column, the concept of development. So the concept of development, I think in the SDGs, but you can debate it, is still the modernist concept of sustainable growth, and that is SDG 8. And SDG 8, on top of my head, I think they're saying 7% economic growth is the achievement. Well, that's not possible, because if we all have 7% economic growth, then we need many more planet Earth. I would say from an African Ubuntu perspective, the concept of human relations is much more important than the concept of development or the concept of growth. Because the concept of development and growth implies a concept of eternal progress. And it also implies that life as it is now is not good. So some of my interviewees said, you know, we don't like this concept of development. We want to talk about human relations, including the past generations and the future generations, and including, of course, our relationship with the earth. So it's a relational way of viewing, and it's not a more abstract, fragmented, you know, goal-oriented way of viewing life. And then I come to my next line, which is about the idea of goals and progress. Now, as you probably know, if you're development practitioners, we had many different decades in which we had different ideologies. And at some point, someone declared the death of ideologies, because development, according to all the different ideologies like gender and good governance and so on, had not really worked in giving the development, between brackets, that Africa needed. So the Africans said to me, but you know, we are much more process oriented. Our languages are verb oriented. They're not noun oriented. So we are thinking in this motion. Like I said, Ubuntu is a word of motion, because Natu is a life force. It comes and it goes, and it is a circle of life. So it's much more a process oriented, horizontal and reciprocal concept. And if I think I should finalize with this and not do the next slide, but the goals versus process also implies a different way of looking at life. So the Western way I basically summarized as doing what is good for yourself and the other, whereas from an Ubuntu perspective, I would say that feeling engagement with the other is a far more important concept. And that would also mean that, for example, in the SDGs, South Africa was very much hammering on the fact that we should talk about how we achieve these goals and the implementation. So if you know, look at the SDGs, you have targets, 1 till 17, and then you have sub-targets, and then you have also ABC. So the ABC is basically the South Africans saying here, this is the way we should implement it. But it's very subservient. It's mostly a goal-oriented framework, which comes from results-based management thinking, because we declared the death of our ideology. So we basically declared also the death of Ubuntu, because you could say it's an ideology or philosophy of life. And therefore, it means that we don't know how we're going to achieve the SDGs. The next one. And maybe I should say one more thing about the leadership style, which is the last row in this column, because I can't treat everything that I want to say. So the leadership style, I would say from a Western perspective, I call that the king style, which we still, I think, have in our current world, which is the one who achieves individual power first and then helps the other people to grow or to develop. So I summarize that as, you know, we have global leadership through the G7, G8, and the G20. So from the Ubuntu perspective, I would say it's more a boatman concept, which is leader and followers empowering each other. So the leader is going in front and taking the others with. So it's a mutually empowering concept of leadership. If you want to read more about leadership, I also wrote an article about the UNESCO concept of leadership and their competences, the competences they identified from basically modern leadership literature, which is basically system leadership. But I compared it with indigenous concepts of leaderships, and then you could still identify a lot of dimensions that are missing. So, for example, empathy and listening. So I'm going to conclude with this. And I hope that we have some more questions, or you're going to stay a little longer, because we stayed a little while. We started a little late so that we can have a little discussion.
I think
we have African participants, so please feel free to comment from your own perspective, because you know it better than I do.
First of all, thank you very much, Dorine. And I think definitely we can add, or at least some of us add some time for the discussion. And yes, please, are there any questions or comments to this really interesting presentation on Ubuntu and Sustainable Development Goals?
Everybody's still chewing on it. I see a remark, yeah, from Clement.
Please, Clement, yeah. You need to turn on, you're muted at the moment. Yes.
I can't hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dorine. Thank you for this interesting and wonderful lecture on Ubuntu and the Sustainable Development Goals. I really like the way you try to conceptualize the concept of Ubuntu. It was very, very good. And then also why you try to link it with sustainable development. But I've got some comment and questions. This is a lecture. I would like to go back to your paper actually to find out this paper is based on which research question. And then I would like to find out what method you used. It's kind of a qualitative research method, or what was a sample for this? I would like to get an idea, but the sample of this, you focus on Nguni people, or the focus in South African, or both in a way South African people are viewing it, and what are the general contribution of this research?
Are you sure that you did?
Yeah. Okay. I think we have a few in our meeting.
Hello?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes, okay, yes. So my first question, so that's my first question. Can I just go for the second one, or you want to?
No, I'll answer them both.
Okay.
So my question was basically, how do philosophies of global South view frameworks like the Sustainable Development Goals? And I looked at that from an economic perspective, or development economics perspective, and from a legal perspective. So in each chapter, I looked at what is the philosophy. Is it a relevant philosophy? Is it a living philosophy? Then I looked at how is it implemented in law, and what did they do in it in court? How is it implemented in policy? And then I looked at how did they take it forward in international diplomatic negotiations. So did South Africa also, or African countries in general, put forward Ubuntu as a concept in the negotiations? Now, negotiations were secret, so that was really difficult because they didn't want to tell me much. But I think that of the 3 continents I studied, that the Africans were actually very muted on their own cultural philosophy, and they were more interested in promoting industry, infrastructure, and economic growth based on the NEPAD philosophy, and less their own cultural values. At the same time, I won't go too deep into this. You asked what my methodology was. That was a really good question, because I did not want to put a Western framework on a non-Western way of looking at life. So that I did not want to put a scientific theory on a philosophy that stands on its own. So that was a bit of a struggle. So I took a post-colonial perspective and a critical realist perspective, basically justifying that I did not want to take a perspective. And that was also really important in doing my interviews, because especially in Latin America, some of the indigenous people said, I don't want to cooperate in your research because I don't believe in science as it is. And you're just going to impose your Western scientific point of view on our culture. So that in the methodology question. What was your last question again?
Just to find out what actually is a contribution, the empirical contribution, or can say the theoretical contribution of this.
I look mainly at,
yes, how it says contribute.
I mainly looked at South Africa as a case, but I did say that I did give examples that these kind of concepts are present in many African cultures. So I gave a lot of examples for that, but I look specifically at South Africa. So I did interviews in or with South Africans, and I must say I did a little more interviews in Latin America and Bhutan than I did in South Africa because of lack of time. And I also used some of the articles which were based on interviewees to prove that South Africa, or that the Ubuntu concept is a living philosophy. So partly I did it. So it was a literature-based research, which was complemented with the interviews.
Okay, thank you very much. But I think that Ubuntu, as the way it is explained in the South African context, I think it's risky to generalize in the rest of Africa. For instance, when you talk about the African proverb, the first one you said, this more when talk about democracy, when the power is coming from all people. What is not the case in more in the Gunic philosophy. In the Gunic philosophy, you find all the king. So the king are not elected, the king are chosen, and if your father was. So this is not really well shared for the rest of Africa. So I find this risky because most of Ubuntu, even though it was imagined in South Africa, but it have a general, several perspectives in different African contexts. But it sounds like your research is really focused on South Africa. Nguni people talk about Xhosa, Zulu, and they talk about Sotho, all those people, all those culture. I know that I have been living in South Africa before I came to France. They have a real culture, but when I look at the rest of Africa, where myself I lived Western Africa, Central Africa, where I'm from, you find that they are totally different. They are on sharing solidarity as Ubuntu, but several other aspects of Ubuntu, if we discuss here, they are not sharing with South Africa. So I think this shared research should, they say, focus into South Africa rather than generalizing the rest of Africa. I think should be a little bit kind of risky. What do you think?
No, you are right that there's a lot of variety and diversity in Africa. I'm not trying to say it's all the same. I think maybe I should have started out with saying that my research is focused on South Africa, but the concept of brotherhood, extended family, and solidarity, as you mentioned, I think is a very general concept throughout Africa, and it's very different from a Western way of viewing at life. So the more, what I just juxtapose is more the individualist versus the collective perspective, which also comes manifest in the African Charter of Human Rights. So I don't think that the Africans for nothing drafted their own Charter of Human Rights, because they wanted the community concept to be more central.
Okay, that's my last observation. Maybe, so I think other colleagues would like to ask. I think what SDGs should rather focus on some of SDGs. When I look at, you mentioned SDG 8, which is a decent work and economic growth. But I think when we look at the concept of Ubuntu, it can help to resolve many other SDGs like poverty and So I think it show, I don't know, your research focus on all 17 SDGs, or you had a certain particular SDG that you would like to see how Ubuntu philosophy can help to resolve, to address?
I did give examples per SDG. I think it's further down in my slides. We don't have time to go into that. But of course, you can't do all Ubuntu with all the SDGs. You can write different articles on every SDG in Ubuntu, which I tend to do. I did a few of them. But I looked more general at, you know, is a framework like that supported in African culture? Would African culture come up with something different?
Thank you very much, Dorine.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Clement. We have another question by Christy, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Dorine. And hello from the other side of the Netherlands. Enschede. My question is just about your conceptualization, a bit about Ubuntu, because I find it quite idealistic. If I look at some, and I share that idealistic point of view. I worked in many NGOs in South Africa, and I saw also experienced Ubuntu firsthand. But currently the debate in South Africa is much more fragmented than I think comes through in your discussion of Ubuntu. If I look at scholars like Bernard Matalino, who says that, you know, we've reached the end of Ubuntu, and even the discussion or the discourse on land at the moment, where even within, you know, rural African communities, there's a bit of a different perspective on should land be compensated for when it's given back to communities or not. It's quite a, yeah, the discussion around Ubuntu I find personally just so fragmented that I really struggle to draw any implication, like I struggle with implications from it, because even in African communities there's such a difference of opinion in what role it should be playing in political and economic decision making. So yeah, I think, do you think also that it's maybe a bit of an idealistic perspective on Ubuntu? Do you agree with that estimation? And then the second question is a bit more on this. In South Africa, there's also this discussion of Ubuntu as there's this critique that it's the elites, right, using it to push certain agendas. You hear Cyril Ramaphosa using Ubuntu a lot. So there is this critique that it's something for universities and political elites, and it's, you know, that it's also being used in ways that's not benefiting rural communities. So is that also something that you address in your research?
Yeah, it's also in the slides that we didn't read. First of all, I have a slide on the criticism at Ubuntu. But what I want to do, yeah, you have to go down, yeah, here, this one, criticism from the West. There's also partly criticism from within also. Oh,
that's good. I like that slide. I hope you're going to send it.
Right. So some people say it's communist, and others say it's anti-communist, and some say it's not valid, which is one of your points, because it's not being implemented by African countries. And some of the South African groups, like the AZAPO, said, you know, it's denying truth and reconciliation, and we want punitive justice, so we don't want the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they did a lawsuit on that. And of course, there's many problems in the way they've implemented it in South Africa within businesses. Where a colleague of mine, Henk van de Heuvel, did a whole thesis on that. He's at the Vrije Universiteit, about how it was used as a slogan and a marketing, but not really reaching to the core and the essence. Then there's also people who say, Clement, that there is no homogeneous African identity. So how are we going to talk about African philosophy? And some people say it's a romanticized idea of the past. But I think what is, first of all, important is that for a long time, there was no recognition that there is such a thing as African philosophy. We said philosophy is European by the European writers. It has to be written, and otherwise it doesn't exist. So I think there's still a big movement, and also within South Africa, to get a proper recognition of what is the African worldview and an African philosophy, and it has equal value and equal standing amongst other philosophies, and therefore there needs to first be an epistemic justice. But at the same time, of course, South Africa, and that's also one of the slides I didn't treat, which goes up, one up, Mondine, which says basically, no, one down, yes, that now people are moving away from Ubuntu. People are adopting Western ways of doing things. And my kids ask me, why did all of this stop? And I don't have an answer. This is one of my interviewees. As we develop and climbed up the ladder of social development, we are becoming very single-minded. This is a worry across the board. We subconsciously know that what is happening is wrong, and we should talk as humans, as people, as humanity. Even if we are not friends, we can interact at the humanitarian level, treat one another with respect, and acknowledge to me that I am, and you acknowledge to I acknowledge to you that you are. Now we live in silos, me, my family, my interests. That is not who we are, and we should not forget who we are and what makes us unique. And as she said, Ubuntu is the pulse of life and the pulse of everything. I really found it very beautiful that she said that out of her own. But so it is embodied in the people, and they know where they're coming from. And at the same time, they know that life in Africa has changed so rapidly, and we're part of one global community that it's very difficult to hold on to the idea of Ubuntu. And it's very difficult to implement land regulations the way they used to. And yeah, it's not so that the past was all perfect. There's also feminists who criticize Ubuntu for female circumcision and patriarchal society and hierarchical king structures that were also there in African society. So yeah, you are right. I'm idealistic. I'm idealistic in trying to promote some form of epistemic justice, because I think that the whole African perspective is basically not acknowledged. We're not aware of it within foreign, Western foreign governments. So my mission was basically to say, but hey guys, we're doing this development cooperation. First of all, Africans don't really like the word development because it suggests that we are ahead of them. And secondly, they want far more deeper relationships with us. And thirdly, if we want to do something like development, you can't do that without knowing the culture and knowing where they're coming from, because then, you know, you may impose concepts that are not really adaptable, or you're coming up with the same conclusions that it didn't work out, and that's the fault of the African people. So I think that if we think in a world community, then the fault is with everyone. The fault is with the economic structures that we have nowadays. So I do agree with all your points of view. That's the implementation part. The implementation is not really working out.
Yeah, no, I also agree with you. I think we're on the same page. I just sometimes, you know, in my own thinking, find it quite difficult, you know, what Ubuntu are we working with? And at the same time, I feel like with new technologies and new frameworks coming in, like I kind of feel like Ubuntu has already been displaced so much that I feel like some of the values are trickling away. So kind of have this feeling of, you know, how do we make sure that this theory that's already been destroyed, you know, especially because it's an oral theory and the communities that were carrying it were kind of, you know, there was a lot of distraction. Like, how do we kind of hold on to these values before Western values kind of like keep on, you know, yeah, destroying what is already feels like it's trickling away. So yeah, it's difficult question of what we are speaking about when we speak about Ubuntu, but we should do a coffee sometime and discuss.
Where are you based, Christy?
Enschede.
Enschede, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. But what I want to say about that, I did do an article on African philosophy of Ubuntu and artificial intelligence, because there's
Peter Paul.
Huh?
Peter Paul sent me that article.
Who?
Peter Paul verbeerd.
Yes, yes.
Paul. Yeah, he's talking about that.
So yeah, so you can apply Ubuntu also as an ethics to modern technology. But I think it's being overlooked because we involve AI experts, but AI experts are often also trained in the global north, and that is not the same as involving an African philosophy professor. And what was the other thing I wanted to say? I lost my point. I think that, yeah, that is what I wanted to say. My aim is now for 2030, because then we're going to have a new discussion within the United Nations about what are the new goals going to be. And I think there's going to be much more emancipation from the global South. And there are governments, and it's also haphazardly implemented. In Latin America, we say we're basing our constitution entirely on our own concept of development, which is buen vivir or harmony with nature. And we're also basing our negotiations on these kind of frameworks completely on the philosophy of harmony with nature. So if you do a new framework in 2030 and you say the goal is harmony with nature, which is something else in sustainable development, then you're going to take it one step further. So I think I'm optimist that the consciousness of Ubuntu is so deeply ingrained in the African mind that's not so easily going to be forgotten. You know, if it's part of your ancestral line, you can't just throw it away and say, okay, we're now all in the Western society, so we're going to be completely submerged in the class society. But then that also requires like an African emancipation in the terms of how they want to negotiate this new set of goals or whatever it's going to be. So I do think that Africa is rising. Maybe Asia will rise first, but Africa will definitely rise afterwards. If not only because there's so much of a young population, and that Africa will have more to say in future, and that the African Union agenda for 2063 also clearly recognizes African cultural identity and cultural heritage. But I don't think it was very much part of the international negotiations. It could be part of it more. And if there is then more for joint forces between continents, which was also not happening for the SDGs because it was the first time it was negotiated. There may be much more power for the global South to make some kind of shift, because if you don't shift at the world level, it's not going to happen in Africa either.
We still have a hand raising by Hekel Son. Please.
Okay. Thank you very much for Dorine's wonderful lecture. I think a lot of things for me to digest. So I used to be exposed to this African philosophy when I was reading some papers related to SDGs or just like justice consideration. So this is the first time I can hear this kind of detailed illustration about this concept. So I think I learned a lot. Because of the time limitation, I think I only can ask you one question. So just like in the title, you just mentioned like human mutual relations, but I really want to know if could you just further illustrate how the human and the nature's relations consideration in the African philosophy, because it seems like for me this kind of consideration only prioritize the society's dimension of sustainable development, while not pay too much attention to the environment dimension. So I'm curious about how about the human and nature's relation in this kind of consideration. So maybe I didn't get clear about your illustration. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hekel. Where are you calling from?
I'm from China.
You're from China. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I referred to it a little bit. But I must say I went much deeper into this relationship with nature in the Latin American philosophy, because the Latin American philosophies of indigenous peoples is very much biocentric. So I'm not sure if I did entire justice to Africa in my research in this respect, but what I came across in the literature was what you said was more starting from the human community and the connection with nature, as I explained it, from the ancestors being connected to the earth and the land, and the future generations as well. So there is no real distinction. There is a community of life. But I do think that in my research, I typified it as in between anthropocentric and biocentric. It's not as biocentric as the indigenous philosophy of the Americas, but it is in essence going towards the biocentric point of view. And of course, there are also indigenous African peoples like the San and the Khoikhoi, or what was used to call the Bushmen, that are still very close and living very close to nature. And I think what is very telling is the fact that a violation of the earth is also called a violation of Ubuntu. So that means that you accord the same respect to the earth or nature as you accord to a fellow human being. So in that sense, it comes very close to biocentrism. But I came across it less than I did in the Latin America literature. So there is one South African activist who's very active also in the rights of nature movement and so on, but he's actually a white African activist. So I do think it's there, but it is more there in the rural communities, and maybe also because I lived in an urban community. So what I experienced was also more a township urban setting. It was also less prominent in my mind when I started Ubuntu research. But I know that Professor Behrens, for example, has looked more at the environmental dimension of Ubuntu. And also, if you look at law cases, there are many law cases in which there's a relationship between cultural rights of people and environmental rights. But it is less based on, in the court cases, on the philosophy of Ubuntu. So I read the book with all the court cases on the philosophy of Ubuntu and the law, and there were no environmental cases in that. But if you take it from the other perspective of the culture of the rural communities, there are more law cases that do also refer to it. So you could say it's also there, but it's a little less prominent in the Ubuntu debate and conversation of current South Africa. But of course, before the whole apartheid took place and people were shifted from their land, there was a much deeper connection also with the land.
Thank you very much. I think we're coming to an end, and I just want to quickly also refer to some discussions going on in the chat. There's like Bruno Noisette, who also talked about how Ubuntu can be generalized beyond the South African context, but I think we have addressed this unless you still want to add something to it. But also, I want to refer to what Dick de Groot said, that kind of, you know, there are a lot of philosophies with this golden rule in the sense of do to someone what you would wish to be done to you. So that exists in different philosophies, and Ubuntu is a really good example of it. And but that there are also a lot of other different systems and decision-making processes, as the Kotla, for example, in Botswana, who also helps to reach a consensus. And I'm asking myself, isn't maybe the importance to talk about Ubuntu not necessarily the kind of the essence of the philosophy itself, because there are different examples too, but isn't it rather more important that kind of there might be a better identification with such universal goals as the SDGs when kind of translating them in a traditional context, which would be in South Africa Ubuntu, but in another context it would be another philosophy. So is kind of does it help to refer to some traditional philosophies that are prominent in a certain context, particularly helpful to increase the identification with such kind of universal sustainable development goals or creation of public value? What would you say to that?
No, I do think that it is, you know, I already talk about the future. Maybe it's because of my own visionary nature. But I do think it's crucial. If you don't translate the SDGs to the local context and local values, they're not going to land. I mean, who knows the SDGs from the ordinary people, even in the Netherlands? Very few people. So yeah, if you don't, but even if you take out the SDGs, but you implement your sustainable development donor programs, if you want to talk about gender in Africa, you need to first understand the local context. Otherwise, you may even make things worse while you think you're making things better. So you have to understand that everything is reasons from the community and family perspective, and not from the individual or woman's perspective. So if you start giving women rights, and at the same time you forget about the man or the family or what they would think about it, then you may put the woman in a more difficult situation. So I think understanding the philosophy of Ubuntu is, you know, requirement number one for anyone who wants to live, work, or cooperate with Africa, or whatever the concept is in Clement, in your culture.
Thank you very much. As said there, I think we are coming to closing. So thank you very much again, Dorine, for your presentation. It was really lively. I've learned a lot, and I think a lot of the participants too, as already raised. And also thank you very much to all the participants and your interest. Just also quickly reminding you of our just a minute, of our future lecture series. We have some other topics, so I'm gonna share that quickly. This year, so already planned up. So we are going to talk about, or Dr. Toussaint Notias, he's going to talk about facial recognition technologies in Africa, from deployment to advocacy. It's going to be in July. Then in October, it's Dr. Luvam Dihar, who is a professor in law, who talks then about norms of solidarity and regionalism through rising state behavior among Southern African states. And at the end of year, so you see, we look really forward already in December. We're going to have a presentation on governing in the semi-shadow of the global West, the case of Moroccan Zawaya, also kind of how public value can be created, not by a Western concept of public governance, but by a traditional concept, Zawaya, that is prominent in Morocco, presented by Salah Rafik and Professor Wolfgang Dressler. So hope you're going to be there also again with us, and of course we keep you up to date. And thank you again, and let's keep in contact. So in case you have any questions, please email, and wish you still a nice morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amandine.
Thank you.
Maybe you can
Thank you very much.
the next lectures.
I'm going to do that, sure.